Book 2, Chapter 4, Sections 21 to 26 of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. 21. And then, as if it were something that everyone in the Dower House had been waiting for, came the message that Hugh had been killed. The telegram was brought up by a girl in a pinafore instead of the boy of the old dispensation, for boys now were doing the work of youths, and youths the work of the men who had gone to the war. Mr. Britling was standing at the front door. He had been surveying the late October foliage, touched by the warm light of the afternoon, when the messenger appeared. He opened the telegram, hoping as he had hoped when he opened any telegram since Hugh had gone to the front, that it would not contain the exact words he read. That it would say wounded, that at the worst it would say missing, that perhaps it might even tell of some pleasant surprise, a brief return to home, such as the last letter had foreshadowed. He read the final, unqualified statement, the terse regrets. He stood quite still for a moment or so, staring at the words. It was 1.25 miles from the post office to the Dower House, and it was always his custom to give telegraph messengers who came to his house twopence, and he wanted very much to get rid of the telegraph girl, who stood expectantly before him, holding her red bicycle. He felt now very sick and strained. He had a conviction that if he did not by an effort maintain his bearing cool and dry, he would howl aloud. He felt in his pocket for money. There were some coppers and a shilling. He pulled it all out together and stared at it. He had an absurd conviction that this ought to be a 6-penny telegram. The thing worried him. He wanted to give the brat 6 pence, and he had only 3 pence and a shilling, and he didn't know what to do, and his brain couldn't think. It would be a shocking thing to give her a shilling, and he couldn't somehow give just coppers for so important a thing as Hugh's death. Then all this problem vanished, and he handed the child the shilling. She stared at him, inquiring, incredulous. "Is there a reply, sir, please?" "No," he said, "that's for you, all of it. This is a peculiar sort of telegram. It's news of importance." As he said this, he met her eyes, and had a sudden persuasion that she knew exactly what it was the telegram had told him, and that she was shocked at this gala-like treatment of such terrible news. He hesitated, feeling that he had to say something else, that he was socially inadequate, and then he decided that at any cost he must get his face away from her staring eyes. She made no movement to turn away. She seemed to be taking him in, recording him for repetition, greedily, with every fibre of her being. He stepped past her into the garden, and instantly forgot about her existence. 22. He had been thinking of this possibility for the last few weeks almost continuously, and yet now that it had come to him, he felt that he had never thought about it before, that he must go off alone by himself to envisage this monstrous and terrible fact, without distraction or interruption. He saw his wife coming down the alley between the roses. He was wrenched by emotions as odd and unaccountable as the emotions of adolescence. He had exactly the same feeling now that he had had when, in his boyhood, some unpleasant admission had to be made to his parents. He felt he could not go through a scene with her yet, that he could not endure the task of telling her, of being observed. He turned abruptly to his left. He walked away as if he had not seen her, across his lawn towards the little summer house upon a knoll that commanded the high road. She called to him, but he did not answer. He would not look towards her, but for a time all his senses were alert to hear whether she followed him. Safe in the summer house, he could glance back. It was all right. She was going into the house. He drew the telegram from his pocket again furtively, almost guiltily, and reread it. He turned it over and read it again. Killed. Then his own voice, hoarse and strange to his ears, spoke his thought. My God! How unutterably silly! Why did I let him go? Why did I let him go? 23. Mrs. Britling did not learn of the blow that had struck them until after dinner that night. She was so accustomed to ignore his incomprehensible moods that she did not perceive that there was anything tragic about him until they sat at table together. He seemed heavy and sulky and disposed to avoid her, but that sort of moodiness was nothing very strange to her. She knew that things that seemed to her utterly trivial, the reading of political speeches in the Times, little comments on life made in the most casual way, mere movements, could so avert him. She had cultivated a certain disregard of such fitful darknesses. But at the dinner table she looked up, and was stabbed to the heart to see a haggard white face and eyes of deep despair regarding her ambiguously. "Hugh," she said, and then with a chill intimation, "What is it?" They looked at each other. His face softened and winced. "My Hugh," he whispered, and neither spoke for some seconds. "Killed," he said, and suddenly stood up whimpering and fumbled with his pocket. It seemed he would never find what he sought. It came at last, a crumpled telegram. He threw it down before her, and then thrust his chair back clumsily and went hastily out of the room. She heard him sob. She had not dared to look at his face again. "Oh!" she cried, realizing that an impossible task had been thrust upon her. "But what can I say to him?" she said, with the telegram in her hand. The parlour-maid came into the room. "Clear the dinner away," said Mrs. Britling, standing at her place. "Master Hugh is killed." And then, wailing, "Oh, what can I say? What can I say?" 24. That night, Mrs. Britling made the supreme effort of her life to burst the prison of self-consciousness and inhibition in which she was confined. Never before in all her life had she so desired to be spontaneous and unrestrained. Never before had she so felt herself hampered by her timidity, her self-criticism, her deeply ingrained habit of never letting herself go. She was rent by reflected distress. It seemed to her that she would be ready to give her life and the whole world to be able to comfort her husband now. And she could conceive no gesture of comfort. She went out of the dining room into the hall and listened. She went very softly upstairs until she came to the door of her husband's room. There she stood still. She could hear no sound from within. She put out her hand and turned the handle of the door a little way, and then she was startled by the loudness of the sound it made, and at her own boldness. She withdrew her hand, and then with a gesture of despair, with a face of white agony, she flitted along the corridor to her own room. Her mind was beaten to the ground by this catastrophe, of which to this moment she had never allowed herself to think. She had never allowed herself to think of it. The figure of her husband, like some pitiful beast, wounded and bleeding, filled her mind. She gave scarcely a thought to Hugh. "Oh, what can I do for him?" she asked herself, sitting down before her unlit bedroom fire. "What can I say or do?" She brooded until she shivered, and then she lit her fire. It was late that night, and after an eternity of resolutions and doubts and indecisions, that Mrs. Britling went to her husband. He was sitting close up to the fire with his chin upon his hands, waiting for her. He felt that she would come to him, and he was thinking meanwhile of Hugh with a slow, unprogressive movement of the mind. He showed by a movement that he heard her enter the room, but he did not turn to look at her. He shrank a little from her approach. She came and stood beside him. She ventured to touch him very softly and to stroke his head. "My dear," she said, "my poor dear." "It is so dreadful for you," she said. "It is so dreadful for you. I know how you loved him." He spread his hands over his face and became very still. "My poor dear," she said, still stroking his hair. "My poor dear." And then she went on saying, "Poor dear," saying it presently because there was nothing more had come into her mind. She desired supremely to be his comfort, and in a little while she was acting comfort so poorly that she perceived her own failure, and that increased her failure, and that increased her paralyzing sense of failure. And suddenly her stroking hand ceased. Suddenly the real woman cried out from her. "I can't reach you," she cried aloud. "I can't reach you. I would do anything. You with your heart half broken." She turned towards the door. She moved clumsily. She was blinded by her tears. Mr. Britling uncovered his face. He stood up, astonished, and then pity and pitiful understanding came storming across his grief. He made a step and took her in his arms. "My dear," he said, "don't go from me." She turned to him weeping, and put her arms about his neck, and he too was weeping. "My poor wife," he said, "my dear wife, if it were not for you, I think I could kill myself tonight. Don't cry, my dear. Don't cry. You do not know how you comfort me. You do not know how you help me." He drew her to him. He put her cheek against his own. His heart was so sore and wounded that he could not endure that another human being should go wretched. He sat down in his chair and drew her upon his knees, and said everything he could think of to console her and reassure her, and make her feel that she was of value to him. He spoke of every pleasant aspect of their lives, of every aspect except that he never named that dear pale youth who waited now. He could wait a little longer. At last she went from him. "Good night," said Mr. Britling, and took her to the door. "It was very dear of you to come and comfort me," he said. 25. He closed the door softly behind her. The door had hardly shut upon her before he forgot her. Instantly he was alone again, utterly alone. He was alone in an empty world. Loneliness struck him like a blow. He had dependents, he had cares. He had never a soul to whom he might weep. For a time he stood beside his open window. He looked at the bed, but no sleep, he knew, would come that night, until the sleep of exhaustion came. He looked at the bureau at which he had so often written, but the writing there was a shriveled thing. This room was unendurable. He must go out. He turned to the window, and outside was a troublesome noise of night jars and a distant roaring of stags, black trees, blacknesses, the sky clear and remote with a great company of stars. The stars seemed attentive. They stirred and yet were still. It was as if they were the eyes of watchers. He would go out to them. Very softly he went towards the passage door, and still more softly felt his way across the landing and down the staircase. Once or twice he paused to listen. He let himself out with elaborate precautions. Across the dark he went, and suddenly his boy was all about him, playing, climbing the cedars, twisting miraculously about the lawn on a bicycle, discoursing gravely upon his future, lying on the grass, breathing very hard, and drawing preposterous caricatures. Once again they walked side by side, up and down. It was athwart this very spot, talking gravely but rather shyly. And here they had stood a little awkwardly, before the boy went in to say good-bye to his stepmother, and go off with his father to the station. "I will work tomorrow again," whispered Mr. Britling, "but tonight is yours. Can you hear me? Can you hear? Your father, who had counted on you." 26. He went into the far corner of the hockey paddock, and there he moved about for a while, and then stood for a long time, holding the fence with both hands and staring blankly into the darkness. At last he turned away and went stumbling and blundering towards the rose garden. A spray of creeper tore his face and distressed him. He thrust it aside fretfully, and it scratched his hand. He made his way to the seat in the arbor, and sat down, and whispered a little to himself, and then became very still, with his arm upon the back of the seat, and his head upon his arm. End of Book 2, Chapter 4. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 1 to 5 of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Book 3, The Testament of Matching Zizi. Chapter the 1st. Mrs. Teddy Goes for a Walk. 1. All over England now, where the livery of mourning had been a rare thing to see, women and children went about in the October sunshine in new black clothes. Everywhere one met these fresh griefs, mothers who had lost their sons, women who had lost their men, lives shattered and hopes destroyed. The dyers had a great time turning colored garments to black. And there was also a growing multitude of crippled and disabled men. It was so in England. Much more was it so in France and Russia, in all the countries of the Allies, and in Germany and Austria. Away into Asia Minor and Egypt, in India and Japan and Italy, there was mourning. The world was filled with loss and mourning and impoverishment and distress. And still the mysterious powers that required these things of mankind were unappeased, and each day added its quota of heart-stabbing messages, and called for new mourning, and sent home fresh consignments of broken and tormented men. Some clung to hopes that became at last almost more terrible than black certainties. Mrs. Teddy went about the village in a colored dress, bearing herself confidently. Teddy had been listed now as missing since reported killed, and she had had 2 letters from his comrades. They said Teddy had been left behind in the ruins of a farm with 1 or 2 other wounded, and that when the Canadians retook the place, these wounded had all been found butchered. None had been found alive. Afterwards the Canadians had had to fall back. Mr. Durrock had been at great pains to hunt up wounded men from Teddy's company, and also any likely Canadians, both at the base hospital in France and in London, and to get what he could from them. He had made it a service to Sissy. Only one of his witnesses was quite clear about Teddy, but he, alas, was dreadfully clear. There had been only 1 lieutenant among the men left behind, he said, and obviously that must have been Teddy. He had been prodded in 6 places. His head was nearly severed from his body. Durrock came down and told the story to Sissy. "Shall I tell it to her?" he asked. Sissy thought. "Not yet," she said. Letty's face changed in those pitiful weeks when she was denying death. She lost her pretty color. She became white. Her mouth grew hard, and her eyes had a hard brightness. She never wept. She never gave a sign of sorrow, and she insisted upon talking about Teddy in a dry, offhand voice. Constantly she referred to his final return. "Teddy," she said, "will be surprised at this," or "Teddy will feel sold when he sees how I have altered that." "Presently we shall see his name in a list of prisoners," she said. "He is a wounded prisoner in Germany." She adopted that story. She had no justification for it, but she would hear no doubts upon it. She presently began to prepare parcels to send him. "They want almost everything," she told people. "They are treated abominably. He has not been able to write to me yet, but I do not think I ought to wait until he asks me." Sissy was afraid to interfere with this. After a time, Letty grew impatient at the delay in getting any address, and took her first parcel to the post office. "Unless you know what prison he is at," said the postmistress. "Pity," said Letty. "I don't know that. Must it wait for that? I thought the Germans were so systematic that it didn't matter." The postmistress made tedious explanations that Letty did not seem to hear. She stared straight in front of her at nothing. Then, in a pause in the conversation, she picked up her parcel. "It's tiresome for him to have to wait," she said, "but it can't be long before I know." She took the parcel back to the cottage. "After all," she said, "it gives us time to get the better sort of throat lozenges for him, the sort the syndicate shop doesn't keep." She put the parcel conspicuously upon the dresser in the kitchen, where it was most in the way, and set herself to make a jersey for Teddy against the coming of the cold weather. But one night the white mask fell for a moment from her face. Sissy and she had been sitting in silence before the fire. She had been knitting. She knitted very badly. And Sissy had been pretending to read, and had been watching her furtively. Sissy eyed the slow, toilsome growth of the slack woolwork for a time, and the touch of angry effort in every stroke of the knitting needles. Then she was stirred to remonstrance. "Poor Letty," she said very softly. "Suppose, after all, he is dead." Letty met her with a pitiless stare. "He is a prisoner," she said. "Isn't that enough? Why do you jab at me by saying that? A wounded prisoner. Isn't that enough despicable trickery for God even to play on Teddy? Our Teddy? To the very last moment he shall not be dead. Until the war is over, until 6 months after the war. I will tell you why, Sissy." She leant across the table and pointed her remarks with her knitting needles, speaking in a tone of reasonable remonstrance. "You see," she said, "if people like Teddy are to be killed, then all our ideas that life is meant for, honesty and sweetness and happiness, are wrong, and this world is just a place of devils, just a dirty, cruel hell. Getting born would be getting damned. And so one must not give way to that idea, however much it may seem likely that he is dead. You see, if he is dead, then cruelty is the law, and someone must pay me for his death. Someone must pay me. I shall wait for 6 months after the war, dear, and then I shall go off to Germany and learn my way about there. And I will murder some German. Not just a common German, but a German who belongs to the guilty kind. A sacrifice. It ought, for instance, to be comparatively easy to kill some of the children of the Crown Prince, or some of the Bavarian princes. I shall prefer German children. I shall sacrifice them to Teddy. It ought not to be difficult to find people who can be made directly responsible, the people who invented the poison gas, for instance, and kill them, or to kill people who are dear to them, or necessary to them. Women can do that so much more easily than men. That, perhaps, is the only way in which wars of this kind will ever be brought to an end, by women insisting on killing the kind of people who make them, rooting them out, by a campaign of pursuit and assassination that will go on for years and years after the war itself is over. Murder is such a little gentle punishment for the crime of war. It would be hardly more than a reproach for what has happened. Falling like snow, death after death, flake by flake. This prince, that statesman, the count who writes so fiercely for war. That is what I am going to do, if Teddy is really dead. We women were ready enough a year or so ago to starve and die for the vote, and that was quite a little thing in comparison with this business. Don't you see what I mean? It's so plain and sensible, Sissy. Whenever a man sits and thinks whether he will make a war or not, then he will think too of women, women with daggers, bombs, of a vengeance that will never tire nor rest, of consecrated, patient women ready to start out upon a pilgrimage that will only end with his death. I wouldn't hurt these war-makers, no, in spite of the poison gas, in spite of trench feet and the men who have been made blind, and the wounded who have lain for days, dying slowly in the wet. Women ought not to hurt, but I would kill, like killing dangerous vermin. It would go on year by year. Balkan kings, German princes, chancellors, they would have schemed for so much, and come to just a rattle in the throat. And if presently other kings and emperors began to prance about and review armies, they too would go. Until all the world understood that women would not stand war any more forever. Of course I shall do something of the sort. What else is there to do now for me? Letty's eyes were bright and intense, but her voice was soft and subdued. She went on after a pause, in the same casual voice. You see now, Sissy, why I cling to the idea that Teddy is alive. If Teddy is alive, then even if he is wounded, he will get some happiness out of it, and all this won't be just rot. If he is dead, then everything is so desperately silly and cruel from top to bottom. She smiled wanly to finish her sentence. But, Letty, said Sissy, there is the boy. I shall leave the boy to you. Compared with Teddy, I don't care that for the boy. I never did. What is the good of pretending? Some women are made like that. She surveyed her knitting. "Poor stitches," she said. "I'm hard stuff, Sissy. I take after mother more than father. Teddy is my darling. All the tenderness of my life is Teddy. If it goes, it goes. I won't crawl about the world like all these other sniveling widows. If they've killed my man, I shall kill. Blood for blood and loss for loss. I shall get just as close to the particular Germans who made this war as I can, and I shall kill them and theirs." "The Women's Association for the Extirpation of the Whole Breed of Warlords," she threw out. "If I do happen to hurt, does it matter?" She looked at her sister's shocked face and smiled again. "You think I go about staring at nothing," she remarked. "Not a bit of it. I have been planning all sorts of things. I have been thinking how I could get to Germany, or when might catch them in Switzerland. I've had all sorts of plans. They can't go guarded forever." "Oh, it makes me despise humanity to see how many soldiers and how few assassins there are in the world, after the things we have seen. If people did their duty by the dagger, there wouldn't be such a thing as a warlord in the world. Not one. The Kaiser and his sons and his sons' sons would know nothing but fear now for all their lives. Fear would only cease to pursue as the coffin went down into the grave. Fear by sea, fear by land, for the vessel he sailed in, the train he travelled in. Fear when he slept for the death in his dreams. Fear when he walked for the death in every shadow. Fear in every crowd, fear whenever he was alone. Fear would stalk him through the trees, hide in the corner of the staircase, make all his food taste perplexingly, so that he would want to spit it out." She sat very still, brooding on that idea for a time, and then stood up. "What nonsense one talks!" she cried, and yawned. "I wonder why poor Teddy doesn't send me a postcard or something to tell me his address. I tell you what I am afraid of sometimes about him, Sissy." "Yes," said Sissy. "Loss of memory. Suppose a beastly lump of shell or something whacked him on the head. I had a dream of him looking strange about the eyes and not knowing me. That, you know, really may have happened. It would be beastly, of course." Sissy's eyes were critical, but she had nothing ready to say. There were some moments of silence. "Oh, bed," said Letty, "though I shall just lie scheming." 2. Sissy lay awake that night, thinking about her sister, as if she had never thought about her before. She began to weigh the concentrated impressions of 1,000 memories. She and her sister were near in age. They knew each other with an extreme intimacy, and yet it seemed to Sissy that night as though she did not know Letty at all. A year ago she would have been certain she knew everything about her. But the old familiar Letty, with the bright complexion and the wicked eye, with her rebellious schoolgirl insistence upon the beautifulness of buffal young men, and her frank and glowing passion for Teddy, with her delight in humorous mystifications and open-air exercise, and all the sunshine and laughter of life. This sister Letty, who had been so satisfactory and complete and final, had been thrust aside like a mask. Sissy no longer knew her sister's eyes. Letty's hand had become thin and unfamiliar and a little wrinkled. She was sharp-featured and thin-lipped. Her acts, which had once been predictable, were incomprehensible, and Sissy was thrown back upon speculations. In their school days, Letty had had a streak of intense sensibility. She had been easily moved to tears. But never once had she wept or given any sign of weeping since Teddy's name had appeared in the casualty list. What was the strength of this tragic tension? How far would it carry her? Was Letty really capable of becoming a Charlotte Corday? of carrying out a scheme of far-seeing vengeance, of making her way through long months and years nearer and nearer to revenge. Were such revenges possible? Would people presently begin to murder the makers of the Great War? What a strange thing it would be in history if so there came a punishment and end to the folly of kings. Only a little while ago, Sissy's imagination might have been captured by so romantic a dream. She was still but a year or so out of the stage of melodrama. But she was out of it. She was growing up now to a subtler wisdom. People, she was beginning to realize, do not do these simple things. They make vows of devotion, and they are not real vows of devotion. They love, quite honestly, and qualify. There are no great revenges, but only little mean ones. No lifelong vindications, except the unrelenting vengeance of the law. There is no real concentration of people's lives anywhere such as romance demands. There is change, there is forgetfulness. Everywhere there is dispersal. Even to the tragic story of Teddy would come the modifications of time. Even to the wickedness of the German princes would presently be added some conflicting aspects. Could Letty keep things for years in her mind, hard and terrible as they were now? Surely they would soften. Other things would overlay them. There came a rush of memories of Letty in a dozen schoolgirl adventures, times when she had ventured and times when she had failed. Letty frightened, Letty vexed, Letty launching out to great enterprises, going high and hard and well for a time, and then failing. She had seen Letty snivelling and dirty, Letty shamed and humiliated. She knew her Letty to the soul. Poor Letty, poor dear Letty. With a sudden clearness of vision, Sissy realized what was happening in her sister's mind. All this tense scheming of revenges was the imaginative play with which Letty warded off the black alternative to her hope. It was not strength, it was weakness. It was a form of giving way. She could not face starkly the simple fact of Teddy's death. That was too much for her. So she was building up this dream of a mission of judgment against the day when she could resist the facts no longer. She was already persuaded, only she would not be persuaded until her dream was ready. If this state of suspense went on, she might establish her dream so firmly that it would at last take complete possession of her mind. And by that time also she would have squared her existence at Matching's Easy with the elaboration of her reverie. She would go about the place then, fancying herself preparing for this tremendous task she would never really do. She would study German maps. She would read the papers about German statesmen and rulers. Perhaps she would even make weak attempts to obtain a situation in Switzerland or in Germany. Perhaps she would buy a knife or a revolver. Perhaps presently she would begin to hover about Windsor or Sandringham when peace was made, and the German cousins came visiting again. Into Sissy's mind came the image of the thing that might be. Letty, shabby, draggled, with her sharp bright prettiness become haggard, an assassin dreamer, still dependent on Mr. Britling, doing his work rather badly, in a distraught, unpunctual fashion. She must be told, she must be convinced soon, or assuredly she would become an eccentric, a strange character, a Matching's Easy Miss Flight. 3. Sissy could think more clearly of Letty's mind than of her own. She herself was in a tangle. She had grown to be very fond of Mr. Durrock, and to have a profound trust and confidence in him, and her fondness seemed able to find no expression at all except a constant girding at his and America's avoidance of war. She had fallen in love with him when he was wearing fancy dress. She was a young woman with a stronger taste for body and color than she supposed. What indeed she resented about him, though she did not know it, was that he seemed never disposed to carry the spirit of fancy dress into everyday life. To begin with, he had touched both her imagination and senses, and she wanted him to go on doing that. Instead of which, he seemed lapsing more and more into reiterated assurances of devotion and the flat, competent discharge of humanitarian duties. Always nowadays he was trying to persuade her that what he was doing was the right and honorable thing for him to do. What he did not realize, what indeed she did not realize, was the exasperation his rightness and reasonableness produced in her. When he saw he exasperated her, he sought very earnestly to be righter and reasonabler, and more plainly and demonstrably right and reasonable than ever. Withal, as she felt and perceived, he was such a good thing, such a very good thing. So kind, so trustworthy, with a sort of slow strength, with a careful honesty, a big, good childishness, a passion for fairness. And so helpless in her hands. She could lash him and distress him, yet she could not shake his slowly formed convictions. When Sissy had dreamt of the lover that fate had in store for her in her old romantic days, he was to be perfect always. He and she were always to be absolutely in the right, and if the story needed it, the world in the wrong. She had never expected to find herself tied by her affections to a man with whom she disagreed, and who went contrary to her standards, very much as if she was lashed on the back of a very nice elephant that would wince to but not obey the goad. So she nagged him and taunted him, and would hear no word of his case. And he wanted dreadfully to discuss his case. He felt that the point of conscience about the munitions was particularly fine and difficult. He wished she would listen and enter into it more. But she thought with that more rapid English flash, which is not so much thinking as feeling. He loved that flash in her, in spite of his persuasion of its injustice. Her thought that he ought to go to the war made him feel like a renegade. But her claim that he was somehow still English held him in spite of his reason. In the midst of such perplexities, he was glad to find one neutral task wherein he could find himself wholeheartedly with and for Sissy. He hunted up the evidence of Teddy's fate with a devoted pertinacity. And in the meanwhile, the other riddle resolved itself. He had had a certain idea in his mind for some time. He discovered one day that it was an inspiration. He could keep his conscientious objection about America and still take a line that would satisfy Sissy. He took it. When he came down to Matching Zizi at her summons to bear his convincing witness of Teddy's fate, he came in an unwonted costume. It was a costume so wonderful in his imagination that it seemed to cry aloud, to sound like a trumpet as he went through London to Liverpool Street Station. It was a costume like an international event. It was a costume that he felt would blare right away to Berlin. And yet it was a costume so commonplace, so much the usual wear now, that Sissy, meeting him at the station, and full of the thought of Letty's trouble, did not remark it, felt indeed rather than observed that he was looking more strong and handsome than he had ever done since he struck upon her imagination in the fantastic wrap that Teddy had found for him, in the merry days when there was no death in the world. And Letty, too, resistant incalculable, found no wonder in the wonderful suit. He bore his testimony. It was the queer, halting telling of a patched-together tale. "I suppose," said Letty, "if I tell you now that I don't believe that officer was Teddy, you will think I am cracked. But I don't." She sat staring straight before her for a time after saying this. Then suddenly she got up and began taking down her hat and coat from the peg behind the kitchen door. The hanging strap of the coat was twisted, and she struggled with it petulantly until she tore it. "Where are you going?" cried Sissy. Letty's voice over her shoulder was the harsh voice of a scolding woman. "I'm going out, anywhere." She turned, coat in hand. "Can't I go out if I like?" she asked. "It's a beautiful day. Mustn't I go out? I suppose you think I ought to take in what you have told me in a moment. Just smile and say, 'Indeed, abandoned, while his men retreated, how jolly!' and then not think of it any more. Besides, I must go out. You two want to be left together. You want to canoodle. Do it while you can." Then she put on coat and hat, jamming her hat down on her head, and said something that Sissy did not immediately understand. "He'll have his turn in the trenches soon enough, now that he's made up his mind. He might have done it sooner." She turned her back as though she had forgotten them. She stood for a moment as though her feet were wooden, not putting her feet as she usually put her feet. She took slow, wide, unsure steps. She went out, like something that is mortally injured and still walks, into the autumnal sunshine. She left the door wide open behind her. 4. And Sissy, with eyes full of distress for her sister, had still to grasp the fact that Durrock was wearing a Canadian uniform. He stood behind her, ashamed that in such a moment this fact and its neglect by everyone could be so vivid in his mind. 5. Sissy's estimate of her sister's psychology had been just. The reverie of revenge had not yet taken a grip upon Letty's mind sufficiently strong to meet the challenge of this conclusive evidence of Teddy's death. She walked out into a world of sunshine, now almost completely convinced that Teddy was dead, and she knew quite well that her dream of some dramatic and terrible vindication had gone from her. She knew that in truth she could do nothing of that sort. She walked out with a set face and eyes that seemed unseeing, and yet it was as if some heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was over. There was no more to hope for, and there was nothing more to fear. She would have been shocked to realize that her mind was relieved. She wanted to be alone. She wanted to be away from every eye. She was like some creature that after a long nightmare incubation is at last born into a clear, bleak day. She had to feel herself. She had to stretch her mind in this cheerless sunshine, this new world where there was to be no more Teddy, and no real revenge nor compensation for Teddy. Teddy was past. Hitherto she had had an angry sense of being deprived of Teddy, almost as though he were keeping away from her. Now there was no more Teddy to be deprived of. She went through the straggling village and across the fields to the hillside that looks away towards Mertensome and its steeple. And where the hill begins to fall away, she threw herself down under the hedge by the path, near by the stile into the lane, and lay still. She did not so much think as remain blank, waiting for the beginning of impressions. It was, as it were, a blank stare at the world. She did not know if it was 5 minutes or half an hour later that she became aware that someone was looking at her. She turned with a start and discovered the Reverend Dimple with one foot on the stile, and an expression of perplexity and consternation upon his chubby visage. Instantly she understood. Already on 4 different occasions since Teddy's disappearance, she had seen the good man coming towards her, always with a manifest decision, always with the same faltering doubt as now. Often in their happy days had she and Teddy discussed him and derided him and rejoiced over him. They had agreed he was as good as Jane Austen's Mr. Collins. He really was very like Mr. Collins, except that he was plumper. And now it was as if he was transparent to her hard defensive scrutiny. She knew he was impelled by his tradition, by his sense of fitness, by his respect for his calling, to offer her his ministrations and consolations, to say his large flat amiabilities over her, and pat her kindly with his hands. And she knew, too, that he dreaded her. She knew that the dear old humbug knew at the bottom of his heart, quite certainly, that he was a poor old humbug, and that she was in his secret. And at the bottom of his heart he found himself too honest to force his poor platitudes upon any who would not be glad of them. If she could have been glad of them, he would have had no compunction. He was a man divided against himself, failing to carry through his rich pretenses, dismayed. He had been taking his afternoon constitutional. He had discovered her beyond the stile, just in time to pull up. Then had come a fatal, a preposterous hesitation. She stared at him now, with hard, expressionless eyes. He stared back at her until his plump pink face was all consternation. He was extraordinarily distressed. It was as if 1,000 unspoken things had been said between them. "No wish," he said. "Intrude." If he had had the Certain-Balm, how gladly would he have given it. He broke the spell by stepping back into the lane. He made a gesture with his hands, as if he would have wrung them. And then he had fled down the lane, almost at a run. "Poor girl!" he shouted. "Poor girl!" and left her staring. Staring, and then she laughed. This was good. This was the sort of thing one could tell Teddy when at last he came back and she could tell him anything. And then she realized again, there was no more Teddy. There would be no telling. And suddenly she fell weeping. "Oh, Teddy, Teddy!" she cried through her streaming tears. "How could you leave me? How can I bear it?" Never a tear had she shed since the news first came, and now she could weep her grief out. She abandoned herself unreservedly to this blessed relief. End of Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 1 to 5. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 6 to 10 of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. 6. There comes an end to weeping at last, and Letty lay still in the red light of the sinking sun. She lay so still that presently a little foraging robin came darting down to the grass not 10 yards away, and stopped and looked at her. And then it came a hop or so nearer. She had been lying in a state of passive abandonment, her swollen wet eyes open, regardless of everything. but those quick movements caught her back to attention. She began to watch the robin, and to note how it glanced sidelong at her and appeared to meditate further approaches. She made an almost imperceptible movement, and straightway the little creature was in a projecting spray of berried hawthorn overhead. Her tear-washed mind became vaguely friendly. With an unconscious effort, it focused down to the robin. She rolled over, sat up, and imitated his friendly cheep. 7. Presently she became aware of footsteps rustling through the grass towards her. She looked over her shoulder and discovered Mr. Britling approaching by the field path. He looked white and tired and listless. Even his bristling hair and moustache conveyed his depression. He was dressed in an old tweed knickerbocker suit and carrying a big atlas and some papers. He had an effect of hesitation in his approach. It was as if he wanted to talk to her and doubted her reception for him. He spoke without any preface. "Durek has told you," he said, standing over her. She answered with a sob. "I was afraid it was so, and yet I did not believe it," said Mr. Britling, "until now." He hesitated as if he would go on, and then he knelt down on the grass a little way from her and seated himself. There was an interval of silence. "At first it hurts like the devil," he said at last, looking away at Murdensome Spire and speaking as if he spoke to no one in particular. "And then it hurts. It goes on hurting, and one can't say much to anyone." He said no more for a time, but the two of them comforted one another, and knew that they comforted each other. They had a common feeling of fellowship and ease. They had been stricken by the same thing. They understood how it was with each other. It was not like the attempted comfort they got from those who had not loved and dreaded. She took up a little broken twig and dug small holes in the ground with it. "It's strange," she said, "but I'm glad I know for sure." "I can understand that," said Mr. Britling. "It stops the nightmares. It isn't hopes I've had so much as fears. I wouldn't admit he was dead or hurt, because I couldn't think it without thinking it horrible. Now—" "It's final," said Mr. Britling. "It's definite," she said after a pause. "It's like thinking he's asleep. For good." But that did not satisfy her. There was more than this in her mind. "It does away with a half and half," she said. "He's dead or he is alive." She looked up at Mr. Britling as if she measured his understanding. "You don't still doubt?" he said. "I'm content now in my mind, in a way. He wasn't anyhow there, unless he was dead. But if I saw Teddy coming over the hedge there to me, it would be just natural. No, don't stare at me. I know really he is dead, and it is a comfort. It is peace. All the thoughts of him being crushed dreadfully, or being mutilated, or lying and screaming, or things like that, they've gone. He's out of his spoiled body. He's my unbroken Teddy again. Out of sight somewhere. Unbroken. Sleeping." She resumed her excavation with the little stick, with the tears running down her face. Mr. Britling presently went on with the talk. "For me it came all at once, without a doubt or a hope. I hoped until the last that nothing would touch you, and then it was like a black shutter falling, in an instant." He considered. "Hugh, too, seems just round the corner at times, but at times it's a blank place." "At times," said Mr. Britling, I feel nothing but astonishment. The whole thing becomes incredible. Just as for weeks after the war began, I couldn't believe that a big modern nation could really go to war, seriously, with its whole heart. And they have killed Teddy and Hugh. They have killed millions, millions, who had fathers and mothers and wives and sweethearts. 8. Somehow I can't talk about this to Edith. It is ridiculous, I know, but in some way I can't. It isn't fair to her. If I could, I would. Quite soon after we were married, I ceased to talk to her. I mean, talking really and simply, as I do to you. And it's never come back. I don't know why. And particularly I can't talk to her of Hugh. Little things, little shadows of criticism, but enough to make it impossible. And I go about thinking about Hugh and what has happened to him sometimes, as though I was stifling. Letty compared her case. I don't want to talk about Teddy. Not a word. That's queer, but perhaps a son is different. Now I come to think of it, I've never talked of Mary. Not to anyone ever. I've never thought of that before, but I haven't. I couldn't. No, losing a lover, that's a thing for oneself. I've been through that, you see. But a son's more outside you, altogether, and more your own making. It's not losing a thing in you, it's losing a hope and a pride. Once when I was a little boy, I did a drawing very carefully. It took me a long time, and a big boy tore it up, for no particular reason, just out of cruelty. That was exactly like losing Hugh. Letty reflected. No, she confessed, I'm more selfish than that. It isn't selfish, said Mr. Britling, but it's a different thing. It's less intimate and more personally important. I have just thought, he's gone. Sometimes, do you know, I have felt quite angry with him. Why need he have gone so soon? Mr. Britling nodded understandingly. I'm not angry. I'm not depressed. I'm just bitterly hurt by the ending of something I had hoped to watch. Always, all my life, he said. I don't know how it is between most fathers and sons, but I admired Hugh. I found exquisite things in him. I doubt if other people saw them. He was quiet, he seemed clumsy, but he had an extraordinary fineness. He was a creature of the most delicate and rapid responses. These aren't my fond delusions. It was so. You know, when he was only a few days old, he would start suddenly at any strange sound. He was alive like an Aeolian harp from the very beginning. And his hair when he was born, he had a lot of hair, was like the down on the breast of a bird. I remember that now very vividly, and how I used to like to pass my hand over it. It was silk, spun silk. Before he was 2, he could talk. Whole sentences. He had the subtlest ear. He loved long words. And then, he said, with tears in his voice, all this beautiful fine structure, this brain, this fresh life as nimble as water, as elastic as a steel spring, it is destroyed. I don't make out he wasn't human. Often and often I have been angry with him and disappointed in him. There were all sorts of weaknesses in him. We all knew them, and we didn't mind them. We loved him the better, and his odd, queer cleverness, and his profound wisdom. And then all this beautiful and delicate fabric, all those clear memories in his dear brain, all his whims, his sudden inventions. You know, I have had a letter from his chum, Park. He was shot through a loophole. The bullet went through his eye and brow. Think of it. An amazement, a blow, A splattering of blood, rags of tormented skin and brain stuff. In a moment, what had taken 18 years, love and care. He sat thinking for an interval, and then went on. The reading and writing alone. I taught him to read myself, because his first governess, you see, wasn't very clever. She was a very good methodical sort, but she had no inspiration. So I got up all sorts of methods for teaching him to read. But it wasn't necessary. He seemed to leap all sorts of difficulties. He leapt to what one was trying to teach him. It was as quick as the movement of some wild animal. He came into life as bright and quick as this robin looking for food. And he's broken up and thrown away, like a cartridge case by the side of a covert. He choked and stopped speaking. His elbows were on his knees, and he put his face between his hands and shuddered and became still. His hair was troubled. The end of his stumpy mustache and a little roll of flesh stood out at the side of his hand and made him somehow twice as pitiful. His big atlas, from which papers projected, seemed forgotten by his side. So he sat for a long time, and neither he nor Letty moved or spoke. But they were in the same shadow. They found great comfort in one another. They had not been so comforted before since their losses came upon them. 9. It was Mr. Britling who broke the silence. And when he drew his hands down from his face and spoke, he said one of the most amazing and unexpected things she had ever heard in her life. The only possible government in Albania, he said, looking steadfastly before him down the hillside, is a group of republican cantons after the Swiss pattern. I can see no other solution that is not offensive to God. It does not matter in the least what we owe to Serbia or what we owe to Italy. We have got to set this world on a different footing. We have got to set up the world at last, on justice and reason. Then, after a pause, the Treaty of Bucharest was an evil treaty. It must be undone. Whatever this German king of Bulgaria does, that treaty must be undone, and the Bulgarians united again into one people. They must have themselves whatever punishment they deserve. They must have nothing more whatever reward they win. She could not believe her ears. After this precious blood, if we leave one plot of wickedness or cruelty in the world. And therewith he began to lecture Letty on the importance of international politics, to everyone. How he and she and everyone must understand, however hard it was to understand. No life is safe, no happiness is safe. There is no chance of bettering life until we have made an end to all that causes war. We have to put an end to the folly and vanity of kings, and to any people ruling any people but themselves. There is no convenience, there is no justice in any people ruling any people but themselves. The ruling of men by others, who have not their creeds and their languages and their ignorances and prejudices. That is the fundamental folly that has killed Teddy and Hugh, and these millions. To end that folly is as much our duty and business as telling the truth or earning a living. But how can you alter it? He held out a finger at her. Men may alter anything if they have motive enough and faith enough. He indicated the atlas beside him. Here I am planning the real map of the world, he said. Every sort of district that has a character of its own must have its own rule, and the great republic of the United States of the world must keep the federal peace between them all. That's the plain sense of life, the Federal World Republic. Why do we bother ourselves with loyalties to any other government but that? It needs only that sufficient men should say it, and that republic would be here now. Why have we loitered so long, until these tragic punishments come? We have to map the world out into its states, and plan its government and the way of its tolerations. And you think it will come? It will come. And you believe that men will listen to such schemes? Said Letty. Mr. Britling, with his eyes far away over the hills, seemed to think. Yes, he said, not perhaps today, not steadily. But kings and empires die. Great ideas, whence they are born, can never die again. In the end, this world republic, this sane government of the world, is as certain as the sunset. Only... He sighed, and turned over a page of his atlas blindly. Only we want it soon. The world is weary of this bloodshed, weary of all this weeping, of this wasting of substance, and this killing of sons and lovers. We want it soon, and to have it soon we must work to bring it about. We must give our lives, what is left of our lives. That is what you and I must do, Letty. What else is there left for us to do? I will write of nothing else. I will think of nothing else now, but of safety and order. So that all these dear dead, not one of them but will have brought the great days of peace and man's real beginning nearer. And these cruel things that make men whimper like children, that break down bright lives into despair, and kill youth at the very moment when it puts out its clean hands to take hold of life, these cruelties, these abominations of confusion, shall cease from the earth forever. 10. Letty regarded him, frowning, and with her chin between her fists. But do you really believe, said Letty, that things can be better than they are? But yes, said Mr. Britling. I don't, said Letty. The world is cruel. It is just cruel, so it will always be. It need not be cruel, said Mr. Britling. It is just a place of cruel things. It is all set with knives. It is full of diseases and accidents. As for God, either there is no God, or he is an idiot. He is a slobbering idiot. He is like some idiot who pulls off the wings of flies. No, said Mr. Britling. There is no progress. Nothing gets better. How can you believe in God after you? Do you believe in God? Yes, said Mr. Britling after a long pause. I do believe in God. Who lets these things happen? She raised herself on her arm and thrust her argument at him with her hand. Who kills my Teddy and your Hugh, and millions? No, said Mr. Britling. But he must let these things happen, or why do they happen? No, said Mr. Britling. It is the theologians who must answer that. They have been extravagant about God. They have had silly absolute ideas, that he is all-powerful, that he's omni-everything. But the common sense of men knows better. Every real religious thought denies it. After all, the real God of the Christians is Christ, not God Almighty. A poor, mocked and wounded God nailed on a cross of matter. Some day he will triumph. But it is not fair to say that he causes all things now. It is not fair to make out a case against him. You have been misled. It is a theologian's folly. God is not absolute. God is finite. A finite God, who struggles in his great and comprehensive way, as we struggle in our weak and silly way, who is with us. That is the essence of all real religion. I agree with you so. Why, if I thought there was an omnipotent God who looked down on battles and deaths and all the waste and horror of this war, able to prevent these things, doing them to amuse himself, I would spit in his empty face. Anyone would. But it's your teachers and catechisms have set you against God. They want to make out he owns all nature, and all sorts of silly claims, like the heralds in the Middle Ages, who insisted that Christ was certainly a great gentleman entitled to bear arms. But God is within nature and necessity. Necessity is a thing beyond God, beyond good and ill, beyond space and time, a mystery everlastingly impenetrable. God is nearer than that. Necessity is the uttermost thing, but God is the innermost thing. Closer he is than breathing, and nearer than hands and feet. He is the other thing than this world, greater than nature or necessity, for he is a spirit and they are blind, but not controlling them, not yet. They always told me he was the maker of heaven and earth. That's the Jew god the Christians took over. It's a quack god, a panacea. It's not my God. Letty considered these strange ideas. I never thought of him like that, she said at last. It makes it all seem different. Nor did I, but I do now. I have suddenly found it and seen it plain. I see it so plain that I am amazed that I have not always seen it. It is, you see, so easy to understand that there is a God, and how complex and wonderful and brotherly he is, when one thinks of those dear boys who by the 1,000, by the 100,000, have laid down their lives. Aye, and there were German boys, too, who did the same. The cruelties, the injustice, the brute aggression. They saw it differently. They laid down their lives. They laid down their lives. Those dear lives, those lives of hope and sunshine. Don't you see that it must be like that, Letty? Don't you see that it must be like that? No, she said, I've seen things differently from that. But it's so plain to me, said Mr. Britling. If there was nothing else in all the world but our kindness for each other, or the love that made you weep in this kind October sunshine, or the love I bear Hugh, if there was nothing else at all, if everything else was cruelty and mockery and filthiness and bitterness, it would still be certain that there was a God of love and righteousness. If there were no signs of God in all the world but the godliness we have seen in those two boys of ours, if we had no other light but the love we have between us. You don't mind if I talk like this? Said Mr. Britling. It's all I can think of now. This God who struggles, who is in Hugh and Teddy, clear and plain, and how he must become the ruler of the world. This God who struggles, she repeated. I have never thought of him like that. Of course he must be like that, said Mr. Britling. How can God be a person? How can he be anything that matters to man, unless he is limited and defined and human like ourselves, with things outside him and beyond him? End of Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 6 to 10. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 11 to 14 of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. 11. Letty walked back slowly through the fields of stubble to her cottage. She had been talking to Mr. Britling for an hour, and her mind was full of the thought of this changed and simplified man, who talked of God as he might have done of a bird he had seen or of a tree he had sheltered under. And all mixed up with this thought of Mr. Britling was the strange idea of God who was also a limited person, who could come as close as Teddy, whispering love in the darkness. She had a ridiculous feeling that God really struggled like Mr. Britling, and that with only some indefinable inferiority of outlook, Mr. Britling loved like God. She loved him for his maps and his dreams and the bareness of his talk to her. It was strange how the straining thought of the dead Teddy had passed now out of her mind. She was possessed by a sense of ending and beginning, as though a page had turned over in her life and everything was new. She had never given religion any thought but contemptuous thought for some years, since indeed her growing intelligence had dismissed it as a scheme of inexcusable restraints and empty pretenses, a thing of discords where there were no discords except of its making. She had been a happy atheist. She had played in the sunshine, a natural creature with the completest confidence in the essential goodness of the world in which she found herself. She had refused all thought of painful and disagreeable things, until the bloody paw of war had wiped out all her assurance. Teddy, the playmate, was over. The love game was ended forever. The fresh, happy acceptance of life as life. And in the place of Teddy was the sorrow of life, the pity of life, and this coming of God out of utter remoteness into a conceivable relation to her own existence. She had left Mr. Britling to his atlas. He lay prone under the hedge, with it spread before him. His occupation would have seemed to her only a little while ago the absurdest imaginable. He was drawing boundaries on his maps very carefully in red ink with a fountain pen. But now she understood. She knew that those red ink lines of Mr. Britling's might in the end prove wiser and stronger than the bargains of the diplomats. In the last hour he had come very near to her. She found herself full of an unwanted affection for him. She had never troubled her head about her relations with anyone except Teddy before. Now suddenly she seemed to be opening out to all the world for kindness. This new idea of a friendly God, who had a struggle of his own, who could be thought of as kindred to Mr. Britling, as kindred to Teddy, had gripped her imagination. He was behind the autumnal sunshine. He was in the little bird that had seemed so confident and friendly. Whatever was kind, whatever was tender, there was God. And 1,000 old phrases she had read and heard and given little heed to, that had lain like dry bones in her memory, suddenly were clothed in flesh and became alive. This God, if this was God, then indeed it was not nonsense to say that God was love, that he was a friend and companion. With him it might be possible to face a world in which Teddy and she would never walk side by side again, nor plan any more happiness forever. After all, she had been very happy. She had had wonderful happiness. She had had far more happiness, far more love in her short years or so than most people had in their whole lives. And so, in the reaction of her emotions, Letty, who had gone out with her head full of murder and revenge, came back through the sunset thinking of pity, of the 1,000 kindnesses and tendernesses of Teddy, that were, after all, perhaps only an intimation of the limitless kindnesses and tendernesses of God. What right had she to a white and bitter grief, self-centered and vindictive, while old Britling could still plan an age of mercy in the earth, and a red gold sunlight that was warm as a smile from Teddy lay on all the world? She must go into the cottage and kiss Sissy, and put away that parcel out of sight until she could find some poor soldier to whom she could send it. She had been pitiless towards Sissy in her grief. She had, in the egotism of her sorrow, treated Sissy as she might have treated a chair or a table, with no thought that Sissy might be weary, might dream of happiness still to come. Sissy had still to play the lover, and her man was already in khaki. There would be no such year as Letty had had in the days before the war darkened the world. Before Sissy's marrying, the peace must come, and the peace was still far away. And Durrock, too, would have to take his chances. Letty came through the little wood and over the stile that brought her into sight of the cottage. The windows of the cottage, as she saw it under the bough of the big walnut tree, were afire from the sun. The crimson rambler over the porch that she and Teddy had planted was still bearing roses. The door was open, and people were moving in the porch. Someone was coming out of the cottage, a stranger in an unfamiliar costume, and behind him was a man in khaki. But that was Mr. Durek, and behind him again was Sissy. But the stranger! He came out of the frame of the porch towards the garden gate. Who was this stranger? It was a man in queer-looking foreign clothes, baggy trousers of some soft-looking blue stuff and a blouse, and he had a white bandaged left arm. He had a hat stuck at the back of his head and a beard. He was entirely a stranger, a foreigner. Was she going insane? Of course he was a stranger. And then he moved a step. He made a queer sideways pace, a caper on the path, and instantly he ceased to be strange and foreign. He became amazingly, incredibly familiar by virtue of that step. No! Her breath stopped. All Letty's being seemed to stop. And the stranger, who was also incredibly familiar, after he had stared at her motionless form for a moment, waved his hat with a gesture that crowned and scaled the effect of familiarity. She gave no sign in reply. No, that familiarity was just a mad freakishness in things. This strange man came from Belgium, perhaps, to tell something about Teddy. And then she surprised herself by making a groaning noise, an absurd, silly noise, just like the noise when one imitates a cow to a child. She said, "Moo," and she began to run forward, with legs that seemed misfits, waving her hands about, and as she ran she saw more and more certainly that this wounded man in strange clothing was Teddy. She ran faster and still faster, stumbling and nearly falling. If she did not get to him speedily, the world would burst. To hold him, to hold close to him. Letty, just one arm. She was clinging to him, and he was holding her. It was all right. She had always known it was all right. Hold close to him. Except just for a little while. But that had been foolishness. Hadn't she always known he was alive? And here he was alive. Hold close to him. Only it was so good to be sure. After all her torment, to hold him, to hang about him, to feel the solid man, kissing her, weeping too, weeping together with her. Teddy, my love! 12. Letty was in the cottage, struggling to hear and understand things too complicated for her emotion-crowded mind. There was something that Mr. Durek was trying to explain about a delayed telegram that had come soon after she had gone out. There was much, indeed, that Mr. Durek was trying to explain. What did any explanation really matter when you had Teddy, with nothing but a strange beard and a bandaged arm between him and yourself? She had an absurd persuasion at first that those two strangenesses would also presently be set aside, so that Teddy would become just exactly what Teddy had always been. Teddy had been shot through the upper arm. My hand has gone, dear little Letty. It's my left hand, luckily. I shall have to wear a hook like some old pirate. There was something about his being taken prisoner. That other officer, that was Mr. Durek's officer, had been lying there for days. Teddy had been shot through the upper arm and stunned by a falling beam. When he came to, he was disarmed, with a German standing over him. Then afterwards he had escaped. In quite a little time he had escaped. He had been in a railway station somewhere in Belgium, locked in a waiting room with 3 or 4 French prisoners, and the junction had been bombed by French and British aeroplanes. Their guard and 2 of the prisoners had been killed. In the confusion, the others had got away into the town. There were trucks of hay on fire, and a store of petrol was in danger. After that, one was bound to escape. One would have been shot if one had been found wandering about. The bomb had driven some splinters of glass and corrugated iron into Teddy's wrist. It seemed a small place at first. It didn't trouble him for weeks, but then some dirt got into it. In the narrow cobbled street beyond the station, he had happened upon a woman who knew no English, but who took him to a priest, and the priest had hidden him. Letty did not piece together the whole story at first. She did not want the story very much. She wanted to know about this hand and arm. There would be queer things in the story when it came to be told. There was an old peasant who had made Teddy work in his fields in spite of his smashed and aching arm, and who had pointed to a passing German when Teddy demurred. There were the people called they, who had at that time organized the escape of stragglers into Holland. There was the night watch, those long nights in succession before the dash for liberty. But Letty's concern was all with the hand. Inside the sling, there was something that hurt the imagination, something bandaged, a stump. She could not think of it. She could not get away from the thought of it. "But why did you lose your hand?" "It was only a little place at first, and then it got painful." "But I didn't go into a hospital, because I was afraid they would intern me, and so I wouldn't be able to come home. And I was dying to come home. I was homesick. No one was ever so homesick. I've thought about this place and the garden, and how one looked out of the window at the passers-by 1,000 times. I seemed always to be seeing them. Old Dimple with his benevolent smile, and Mrs. Wolker at the end cottage, and how she used to fetch her beer and wink when she caught us looking at her, and little Charlie Slobberface sniffing on his way to the pigs, and all the rest of them. And you, Letty, particularly you. And how we used to lean on the window-sill with our shoulders touching, and your cheek just in front of my eyes, and nothing aching at all in one. How I thought of that and longed for that. And so you see, I didn't go to the hospital. I kept hoping to get to England first, and I left it too long." "Life's come back to me with you," said Letty. "Until just today I've believed you'd come back. And today I doubted. I thought it was all over, all the real life, love and the dear fun of things, and that there was nothing before me but just holding out and keeping your memory. Poor arm, and being kind to people, and pretending you were alive somewhere. I'll not care about the arm. In a little while, I'm glad you've gone, but I'm gladder you're back and can never go again. And I will be your right hand, dear, and your left hand, and all your hands. Both my hands for your dear lost left one. And you shall have 3 hands instead of 2. 13. Letty stood by the window, as close as she could to Teddy, in a world that seemed wholly made up of unexpected things. She could not heed the others. It was only when Teddy spoke to the others, or when they spoke to Teddy, that they existed for her. For instance, Teddy was presently talking to Mr. Durrock. They had spoken about the Canadians who had come up and relieved the Essex men after the fight in which Teddy had been captured. And then it was manifest that Mr. Durrock was talking of his regiment. "I'm not the only American who has gone Canadian, for the duration of the war." He had got to his explanation at last. "I've told a lie," he said triumphantly. "I've shifted my birthplace 600 miles. Mind you, I don't admit a thing that Sissy has ever said about America. Not one thing. You don't understand the sort of proposition America is up against. America is the new world, where there are no races and nations anymore. She is the melting pot from which we will cast the better state. I've believed that always. In spite of 1,000 little things, I believe it now. I go back on nothing. I'm not fighting as an American either. I'm fighting simply as myself. I'm not going fighting for England, mind you. Don't you fancy that? I don't know I'm so particularly in love with a lot of English ways as to do that. I don't see how anyone can be very much in love with your empire, with its dead-alive court, its artful politicians, its lords and ladies and snobs, its way with the Irish, and its way with India, and everybody shifting responsibility and telling lies about your common people. I'm not going fighting for England. I'm going fighting for Sissy. And justice and Belgium and all that, but more particularly for Sissy. And anyhow, I can't look Pa Britling in the face anymore. And I want to see those trenches, close. I reckon they're a thing it will be interesting to talk about some day. So I'm going, said Mr. Durek. But chiefly, it's Sissy. See? Sissy had come and stood by the side of him. She looked from poor broken Teddy to him and back again. "Up to now," she said, "I've wanted you to go." Tears came into her eyes. "I suppose I must let you go," she said. "Oh, I'd hate you not to go." 14. "Good God! How old the master looks!" cried Teddy suddenly. He was standing at the window, and as Mr. Durek came forward inquiringly, he pointed to the figure of Mr. Britling, passing along the road towards the Dower House. "He does look old. I hadn't noticed," said Mr. Durek. "Why, he's gone grey!" cried Teddy, peering. "He wasn't grey when I left." They watched the knickerbockered figure of Mr. Britling receding up the hill, atlas and papers in his hands behind his back. "I must go out to him," said Teddy, disengaging himself from Letty. "No," she said, arresting him with her hand. "But he will be glad." She stood in her husband's way. She had a vision of Mr. Britling, suddenly called out of his dreams of God ruling the United States of the world, to rejoice at Teddy's restoration. "No," she said, "it will only make him think again of Hugh, and how he died. Don't go out, Teddy, not now. What does he care for you? Let him rest from such things. Leave him to dream over his atlas. He isn't so desolate, if you knew. I will tell you, Teddy, when I can. But just now, no, he will think of Hugh again. Let him go. He has God and his atlas there. They're more than you think." End of Book 3, Chapter 1. Book 3, Chapter 2, Sections 1 to 4 of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter the 2nd. Mr. Britling Writes Until Sunrise. 1. It was some weeks later. It was now the middle of November, and Mr. Britling, very warmly wrapped in his thick dressing-gown and his thick llama-wool pajamas, was sitting at his night-desk and working ever and again at an essay of preposterous ambitions, for the title of it was The Better Government of the World. Latterly he had had much sleepless misery. In the day life was tolerable, but in the night, unless he defended himself by working, the losses and cruelties of the war came and grimaced at him insufferably. Now he would be haunted by long processions of refugees. Now he would think of the dead lying stiff and twisted in 1,000 dreadful attitudes. Then again he would be overwhelmed with anticipations of the frightful economic and social dissolution that might lie ahead. At other times he thought of wounds and the deformities of body and spirit produced by injuries. And sometimes he would think of the triumph of evil. Stupid and triumphant persons went about a world that stupidity had desolated, with swaggering gestures, with a smiling consciousness of enhanced importance, with their scornful hatred of all measured and temperate and kindly things, turned now to scornful contempt. And mingling with the soil they walked on lay the dead body of Hugh, face downward. At the back of the boy's head, rimmed by blood-stiffened hair, the hair that had once been as soft as the down of a bird, was a big red hole. That hole was always pitilessly distinct. They stepped on him, heedlessly. They healed the scattered stuff of his exquisite brain into the clay. From all such moods of horror, Mr. Britling's circle of lamplight was his sole refuge. His work could conjure up visions, like opium visions, of a world of order and justice. Amidst the gloom of world bankruptcy, he stuck to the prospectus of a braver enterprise, reckless of his chances of subscribers. 2. But this night, even the circle of lamplight would not hold his mind. Doubt had crept into this last fastness. He pulled the papers towards him and turned over the portion he had planned. His purpose in the book he was beginning to write was to reason out the possible methods of government that would give a stabler, saner control to the world. He believed still in democracy, but he was realizing more and more that democracy had yet to discover its method. It had to take hold of the consciences of men. It had to equip itself with still unformed organizations. Endless years of patient thinking, of experimenting, of discussion lay before mankind, ere this great idea could become reality, and right, the proven right thing, could rule the earth. Meanwhile, the world must still remain a scene of blood-stained melodrama, of deafening noise, contagious follies, vast irrational destructions. One fine life after another went down from study and university and laboratory to be slain and silenced. Was it conceivable that this mad monster of mankind would ever be caught and held in the thin-spun webs of thought? Was it, after all, anything but pretension and folly for a man to work out plans for the better government of the world? Was it any better than the ambitious scheming of some fly upon the wheel of the romantic gods? Man has come, floundering and wounding and suffering, out of the breeding darknesses of time that will presently crush and consume him again. Why not flounder with the rest? Why not eat, drink, fight, scream, weep, and pray? Forget Hugh. Stop brooding upon Hugh. Banish all these priggish dreams of the better government of the world, and turn to the brighter aspects, the funny and adventurous aspects of the war, the Chestertonian jolliness, punch side of things. Think you, because your sons are dead, that there will be no more cakes and ale? Let mankind blunder out of the mud and blood, as mankind has blundered in. Let us, at any rate, keep our precious sense of humor. He pulled his manuscript towards him. For a time he sat decorating the lettering of his title, The Better Government of the World, with little grinning gnomes' heads and waggish tails. 3. On the top of Mr. Britling's desk, beside the clock, lay a letter, written in clumsy English and with its envelope resealed by a label which testified that it had been opened by censor. The friendly go-between in Norway had written to tell Mr. Britling that Herr Heinrich also was dead. He had died a wounded prisoner in Russia some months ago. He had been wounded and captured after undergoing great hardships during the great Russian attack upon the passes of the Carpathians in the early spring, and his wound had mortified. He had recovered partially for a time, and then he had been beaten and injured again in some struggle between German and Croatian prisoners, and he had sickened and died. Before he died, he had written to his parents, and once again he had asked that the fiddle he had left in Mr. Britling's care should, if possible, be returned to them. It was manifest that both for him and them now, it had become a symbol with many associations. The substance of this letter invaded the orange circle of the lamp. It would have to be answered, and the potentialities of the answer were running through Mr. Britling's brain to the exclusion of any impersonal composition. He thought of the old parents away there in Pomerania. He believed, but he was not quite sure, that Heinrich had been an only son, and of the pleasant spectacled figure that had now become a broken and decaying thing in a prisoner's shallow grave. Another son had gone. All the world was losing its sons. He found himself thinking of young Heinrich in the very manner, if with a lesser intensity, in which he thought about his own son, as of hopes senselessly destroyed. His mind took no note of the fact that Heinrich was an enemy, that by the reckoning of a war of attrition, his death was balance and compensation for the death of Hugh. He went straight to the root fact that they had been gallant and kindly beings, and that the same thing had killed them both. By no conceivable mental gymnastics could he think of the two as antagonists. Between them there was no imaginable issue. They had both very much the same scientific disposition, with perhaps more dash and inspiration in the quality of Hugh, more docility and method in the case of Karl, until war had smashed them one against the other. He recalled his first sight of Heinrich at the junction, and how he had laughed at the sight of his excessive Teutonism. The close-cropped, shining fair head, surmounted by a yellowish-white cork cap, had appeared dodging about among the people upon the platform, and manifestly asking questions. The face had been very pink with the effort of an unaccustomed tongue. The young man had been clad in a suit of white flannel, refined by a purple line. His boots were of that greenish-yellow leather that only a German student could esteem chic. His rucksack was upon his back, and the precious fiddle in its case was carried very carefully in one hand, this same dead fiddle. The other hand held a stick with a carved knob and a pointed end. He had been too German for belief. "Herr Heinrich," Mr. Britling had said, and straightway the heels had clashed together for a bow from the waist, a bow that a heedless old lady, much burthened with garden produce, had greatly disarranged. From first to last, amidst our off-hand English ways, Herr Heinrich had kept his bow, and always it had been getting disarranged. That had been his constant effect. A little stiff, a little absurd, and always clean and pink and methodical. The boys had liked him without reserve. Mrs. Britling had liked him. Everybody had found him a likable creature. He never complained of anything except picnics. But he did object to picnics, to the sudden departure of the family to wild surroundings, for the consumption of cold, knifeless and forkless meals in the serious middle hours of the day. He protested to Mr. Britling, respectfully but very firmly. It was, he held, implicit in their understanding that he should have a cooked meal in the middle of the day. Otherwise his noggin was perplexed and disordered. In the evening he could not eat with any gravity or profit. Their disposition towards underfeeding, and a certain lack of fine sentiment, were the only flaws in the English scheme that Herr Heinrich admitted. He certainly found the English unfeeling. His heart went even less satisfied than his noggin. He was a being of expressive affections. He wanted great friendships, mysterious relationships, love. He tried very bravely to revere and to understand and be occultly understood by Mr. Britling. He sought long walks and deep talks with Hugh and the small boys. He tried to fill his heart with Sissy. He found at last marvels of innocence and sweetness in the Hickson girl. She wore her hair in a pigtail when first he met her, and it made her almost Marguerite. This young man had cried aloud for love, warm and filling, like the Mittagsesen that was implicit in their understanding. And all these Essex people failed to satisfy him. They were silent, they were subtle, they slipped through the fat yet eager fingers of his heart, so that he fell back at last upon himself, and his German correspondence, and the idealization of Maud Hickson, and the moral education of Billy. Billy. Mr. Britling's memories came back at last to the figure of young Heinrich with the squirrel on his shoulder that had so often stood in the way of the utter condemnation of Germany. That, seen closely, was the stuff of one brutal Prussian. What quarrel had we with him? Other memories of Heinrich flitted across Mr. Britling's reverie. Heinrich at hockey, running with extreme swiftness and little skill, tricked and baffled by Letty, dodged by Hugh, going headlong forward and headlong back, and then with a cry flinging himself flat on the ground, exhausted. Or again, Heinrich very grave and very pink, peering through his glasses at his cards at Scott. Or Heinrich in the boats upon the great pond, or Heinrich swimming, or Heinrich hiding very, very artfully from the boys about the garden on a theory of his own, or Heinrich in strange postures, stalking the deer in Clavering's Park. For a time he had had a great ambition to creep quite close to a deer and touch it. Or Heinrich indexing. He had a passion for listing and indexing books, music, any loose classifiable thing. His favorite amusement was devising schemes for the indentation of dictionary leaves, so that one could turn instantly to the needed word. He had bought and cut the edges of 3 dictionaries, each in succession improved upon the other. He had had great hopes of patents and wealth arising therefrom. And his room had been a source of strange sounds, his search for music upon the violin. He had hoped when he came to Matching's Easy to join some string quartet. But Matching's Easy produced no string quartet. He had to fall back upon the pianola and try to play duets with that. Only the pianola did all the duet itself, and in the hands of a small Britling was apt to betray a facetious moodiness, sudden alternations between extreme haste and extreme lassitude. Then there came a memory of Heinrich talking very seriously, his glasses magnifying his round blue eyes, talking of his ideas about life, of his beliefs and disbeliefs, of his ambitions and prospects in life. He confessed 2 principal ambitions. They varied perhaps in their absolute dimensions, but they were of equal importance in his mind. The first of these was, so soon as he had taken his doctorate in philology, to give himself to the perfecting of an international language. It was to combine all the virtues of Esperanto and Edo. "And then," said Herr Heinrich, "I do not think there will be any more wars, ever." The second ambition, which was important first because Herr Heinrich found much delight in working at it, and secondly because he thought it would give him great wealth and opportunity for propagating the perfect speech, was the elaboration of his system of marginal indentations for dictionaries and alphabetical books of reference of all sorts. It was to be so complete that one would just stand over the book to be consulted, run hand and eye over its edges, and open the book, at the very exact spot. He proposed to follow this business up with a quite Germanic thoroughness. "Presently," he said, "I must study the machinery by which the edges of books are cut. It is possible I may have to invent these also." This was the double-barreled scheme of Herr Heinrich's career, and along it he was to go, and incidentally develop his large, vague heart that was at present so manifestly unsatisfied. Such was the brief story of Herr Heinrich. That story was over, just as Hugh's story was over. That first volume would never now have a second and a third. It ended in some hasty grave in Russia. The great scheme for marginal indices would never be patented. The duets with the pianola would never be played again. Imagination glimpsed a little figure toiling manfully through the slush and snow of the Carpathians, saw it staggering under its first experience of shell-fire, set it amidst attacks and flights and fatigue and hunger and a rush perhaps in the darkness, guessed at the wounding blow. Then came the pitiful pilgrimage of the prisoners into captivity, captivity in a land desolated, impoverished, and embittered. Came wounds wrapped in filthy rags, pain and want of occupation, and a poor little bent and broken Heinrich sitting aloof in a crowded compound, nursing a mortifying wound. He used always to sit in a peculiar attitude, with his arms crossed on his crossed legs, looking slantingly through his glasses. So he must have sat, and presently he lay on some rough bedding and suffered, untended, in infinite discomfort. Lay motionless, and thought at times, it may be, of matching Zizi, and wondered what Hugh and Teddy were doing. Then he became fevered, and the world grew bright-colored and fantastic and ugly for him, until one day an infinite weakness laid hold of him, and his pain grew faint, and all his thoughts and memories grew faint, and still fainter. The violin had been brought into Mr. Britling's study that afternoon, and lay upon the further window-seat. Poor little broken sherd, poor little fragment of a shattered life. It looked in its case like a baby in a coffin. "I must write a letter to the old father and mother," Mr. Britling thought. "I can't just send the poor little fiddle, without a word. In all this pitiful storm of witless hate, surely there may be one greeting, not hateful." "From my blackness to yours," said Mr. Britling aloud. He would have to write it in English, but even if they knew no English, someone would be found to translate it to them. He would have to write very plainly. 4. He pushed aside the manuscript of The Better Government of the World, and began to write rather slowly, shaping his letters roundly and distinctly. "Dear Sir, I am writing this letter to you, to tell you I am sending back the few little things I had kept for your son, at his request, when the war broke out. I am sending them—" Mr. Britling left that blank for the time, until he could arrange the method of sending to the Norwegian intermediary. Especially I am sending his violin, which he had asked me thrice to convey to you. Either it is a gift from you, or it symbolized many things for him that he connected with home and you. I will have it packed with particular care, and I will do all in my power to ensure its safe arrival. I want to tell you that all the stress and passion of this war has not made us here in Matchings Easy forget our friend, your son. He was one of us, he had our affection, he had friends here who are still his friends. We found him honorable and companionable, and we share something of your loss. I have got together for you a few snapshots I chance to possess, in which you will see him in the sunshine, and which will enable you perhaps to picture a little more definitely than you would otherwise do the life he led here. There is one particularly that I have marked. Our family is lunching out of doors, and you will see that next to your son is a youngster, a year or so his junior, who is touching glasses with him. I have put a cross over his head. He is my eldest son. He was very dear to me, and he too has been killed in this war. They are, you see, smiling very pleasantly at each other. While writing this, Mr. Britling had been struck by the thought of the photographs, and he had taken them out of the little drawer into which he was accustomed to thrust them. He picked out the ones that showed the young German, but there were others, bright with sunshine, that were now charged with acquired significances. There were two showing the children and Teddy and Hugh and Sissy and Letty doing the goose step, and there was one of Mr. Vonderpont, smiling at the front door, in Heinrich's abandoned slippers. There were endless pictures of Teddy also. It is the happy instinct of the Kodak to refuse those days that are overcast, and the photographic record of a life is a chain of all its kindlier aspects. In the drawer above these snapshots there were Hugh's letters, and a miscellany of trivial documents touching on his life. Mr. Britling discontinued writing, and turned these papers over and mused. Heinrich's letters and postcards had got in among them, and so had a letter of Teddy's. The letters reinforced the photographs in their reminder of how kind and pleasant a race mankind can be, until the wild asses of nationalism came kicking and slaying amidst them, until suspicion and jostling greed and malignity poisoned their minds, until the fools with the high explosives blow that elemental goodness into shrieks of hate and splashes of blood. How kindly men are, up to the very instant of their cruelties. His mind teemed suddenly with little anecdotes and histories of the goodwill of men breaking through the ill will of war, of the mutual help of sorely wounded Germans and English lying together in the mud and darkness between the trenches, of the fellowship of captors and prisoners, of the Saxons at Christmas fraternizing with the English. Of that he had seen photographs in one of the daily papers. His mind came back presently from these wanderings to the task before him. He tried to picture these Heinrich parents. He supposed they were kindly, civilized people. It was manifest the youngster had come to him from a well-ordered and gentle-spirited home. But he imagined them, he could not tell why, as people much older than himself. Perhaps young Heinrich had on some occasion said they were old people. He could not remember. And he had a curious impulse, too, to write to them in phrases of consolation, as if their loss was more pitiable than his own. He doubted whether they had the consolation of his sanguine temperament, whether they could resort as readily as he could to his faith, whether in Pomerania there was the same consoling possibility of an essay on the better government of the world. He did not think this very clearly, but that was what was at the back of his mind. He went on writing. If you think that these two boys have both perished, not in some noble common cause, but one against the other, in a struggle of dynasties and boundaries, and trade routes and tyrannous ascendancies, then it seems to me that you must feel as I feel, that this war is the most tragic and dreadful thing that has ever happened to mankind." He sat thinking for some minutes after he had written that, and when presently he resumed his writing, a fresh strain of thought was traceable even in his opening sentence. "If you count dead and wounds, this is the most dreadful war in history. For you, as for me, it has been almost the extremity of personal tragedy. Black sorrow. But is it the most dreadful war? I do not think it is. I can write to you and tell you that I do indeed believe that our 2 sons have died not altogether in vain. Our pain and anguish may not be wasted, may be necessary. Indeed, they may be necessary. Here am I bereaved and wretched, and I hope. Never was the fabric of war so black, that I admit, but never was the black fabric of war so threadbare. At 1,000 points the light is shining through." Mr. Britling's pen stopped. There was perfect stillness in the study bedroom. "The tin-pot style," said Mr. Britling at last, in a voice of extreme bitterness. He fell into an extraordinary quarrel with his style. He forgot about those Pomeranian parents altogether, in his exasperation at his own inexpressiveness, at his incomplete control of these rebel words and phrases that came trailing each its own associations and suggestions to hamper his purpose with it. He read over the offending sentence. "The point is that it is true," he whispered. "It is exactly what I want to say." Exactly? His mind stuck on that exactly. When one has much to say, style is troublesome. It is as if one fussed with one's uniform before a battle. But that is just what one ought to do before a battle. One ought to have everything in order. He took a fresh sheet and made 3 trial beginnings. War is like a black fabric. War is a curtain of black fabric across the pathway. War is a curtain of dense black fabric across all the hopes and kindliness of mankind, yet always it has let through some gleams of light, and now, I am not dreaming, it grows threadbare, and here and there and at 1,000 points the light is breaking through. We owe it to all these dear youths. His pen stopped again. I must work on a rough draft, said Mr. Britling. End of Book 3, Chapter 2, Sections 1 to 4. Book 3, Chapter 2, Sections 5 to 12 of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. 5. 3 hours later, Mr. Britling was working by daylight, though his study lamp was still burning, and his letter to old Heinrich was still no better than a collection of material for a letter. But the material was falling roughly into shape, and Mr. Britling's intentions were finding themselves. It was clear to him now that he was no longer writing as his limited personal self to those 2 personal selves grieving in the old, large, high-walled, steep-roofed household amidst pine woods of which Heinrich had once shown him a picture. He knew them too little for any such personal address. He was writing, he perceived, not as Mr. Britling, but as an Englishman. That was all he could be to them. And he was writing to them as Germans. He could apprehend them as nothing more. He was just England bereaved to Germany bereaved. He was no longer writing to the particular parents of one particular boy, but to all that mass of suffering, regret, bitterness, and fatigue that lay behind the veil of the front. Slowly, steadily, the manhood of Germany was being wiped out. As he sat there in the stillness, he could think that at least 2 million men of the Central Powers were dead, and an equal number maimed and disabled. Compared with that, our British losses, immense and universal as they were by the standard of any previous experience, were still slight. Our larger armies had still to suffer, and we had lost irrevocably not very much more than 250,000. But the tragedy gathered against us. We knew enough already to know what must be the reality of the German homes to which those dead men would never more return. If England had still the longer account to pay, the French had paid already, nearly to the limits of endurance. They must have lost well over 1 million of their mankind, and still they bled and bled. Russia, too, in the East, had paid far more than man for man in this vast swapping off of lives. In a little while, no censorship would hold the voice of the peoples. There would be no more talk of honor and annexations, hegemonies and trade routes, but only Europe lamenting for her dead. The Germany to which he wrote would be a nation of widows and children, rather pinched boys and girls, crippled men, old men, deprived men, men who had lost brothers and cousins and friends and ambitions. No triumph now on land or sea could save Germany from becoming that. France, too, would be that, Russia and lastly Britain, each in their degree. Before the war, there had been no Germany to which an Englishman could appeal. Germany had been a threat, a menace, a terrible trampling of armed men. It was as little possible then to think of talking to Germany as it would have been to have stopped the Kaiser in mid-career in his hooting car down the Unter den Linden and demand a quiet talk with him. But the Germany that had watched those rushes with a slightly doubting pride had her eyes now full of tears and blood. She had believed, she had obeyed, and no real victory had come. Still she fought on, bleeding, agonizing, wasting her substance and the substance of the whole world, to no conceivable end but exhaustion. So capable she was, so devoted, so proud and utterly foolish. And the mind of Germany, whatever it was before the war, would now be something residual, something left over, and sitting beside a reading lamp, as he was sitting beside a reading lamp, thinking, sorrowing, counting the cost, looking into the dark future. And to that he wrote, to that dimly apprehended figure outside a circle of the light, like his own circle of light, which was the father of Heinrich, which was great Germany, Germany which lived before and which will yet outlive the flapping of the eagles. Our boys, he wrote, have died, fighting one against the other. They have been fighting upon an issue so obscure that your German press is still busy discussing what it was. For us, it was that Belgium was invaded and France in danger of destruction. Nothing else could have brought the English into the field against you. But why you invaded Belgium and France, and whether that might have been averted, we do not know to this day. And still this war goes on, and still more boys die, and these men who do not fight, these men in the newspaper offices and in the ministries, plan campaigns and strokes and counterstrokes that belong to no conceivable plan at all. Except that now, for them, there is something more terrible than war, and that is the day of reckoning with their own people. What have we been fighting for? What are we fighting for? Do you know? Does anyone know? Why am I spending what is left of my substance, and you what is left of yours, to keep on this war against each other? What have we to gain from hurting one another still further? Why should we be puppets any longer in the hands of crowned fools and witless diplomatists? Even if we were dumb and acquiescent before, does not the blood of our sons now cry out to us that this foolery should cease? We have let these people send our sons to death. It is you and I who must stop these wars, these massacres of boys. Massacres of boys. That indeed is the essence of modern war. The killing off of the young. It is the destruction of the human inheritance. It is the spending of all the life and material of the future upon present-day hate and greed. Fools and knaves, politicians, tricksters, and those who trade on the suspicions and thoughtless, generous angers of men make wars. The indolence and modesty of the mass of men permit them. Are you and I to suffer such things until the whole fabric of our civilization, that has been so slowly and so laboriously built up, is altogether destroyed? When I sat down to write to you, I had meant only to write to you of your son and mine. But I feel that what can be said in particular of our loss need not be said. It can be understood without saying. What needs to be said and written about is this, that war must be put an end to, and that nobody else but you and me and all of us can do it. We have to do that for the love of our sons and our race and all that is human. War is no longer human. The chemist and the metallurgist have changed all that. My boy was shot through the eye. His brain was blown to pieces by some man who never knew what he had done. Think what that means. It is plain to me, surely it is plain to you and all the world, that war is now a mere putting of the torch to explosives that flare out to universal ruin. There is nothing for one sane man to write to another about in these days but the salvation of mankind from war. Now, I want you to be patient with me and hear me out. There was a time in the earlier part of this war when it was hard to be patient, because there hung over us the dread of losses and disaster. Now we need dread no longer. The dreaded thing has happened. Sitting together, as we do in spirit, beside the mangled bodies of our dead, surely we can be as patient as the hills. I want to tell you quite plainly and simply that I think that Germany, which is chief and central in this war, is most to blame for this war. Writing to you as an Englishman to a German, and with war still being waged, there must be no mistake between us upon this point. I am persuaded that in the decade that ended with your overthrow of France in 1871, Germany turned her face towards evil, and that her refusal to treat France generously and to make friends with any other great power in the world is the essential cause of this war. Germany triumphed, and she trampled on the loser. She inflicted intolerable indignities. She set herself to prepare for further aggressions. Long before this killing began, she was making war upon land and sea, launching warships, building strategic railways, setting up a vast establishment of war material, threatening, straining all the world to keep pace with her threats. At last there was no choice before any European nation but submission to the German will or war. And it was no will to which righteous men could possibly submit. It came as an illiberal and ungracious will. It was the will of Zabern. It is not as if you had set yourselves to be an imperial people and embrace and unify the world. You did not want to unify the world. You wanted to set the foot of an intensely national Germany, a sentimental and illiberal Germany, a Germany that treasured the portraits of your ridiculous Kaiser and his litter of sons, a Germany wearing uniform, reading black letter, and despising every Kultur but her own, upon the neck of a divided and humiliated mankind. It was an intolerable prospect. I had rather the whole world died. Forgive me for writing you. You are as little responsible for that Germany as I am for Sir Edward Grey. But this happened over you. You did not do your utmost to prevent it, even as England has happened, and I have let it happen over me. "It is so dry, so general," whispered Mr. Britling. "And yet it is this that has killed our sons." He sat still for a time, and then went on reading a fresh sheet of his manuscript. "When I bring these charges against Germany, I have little disposition to claim any righteousness for Britain. There has been small splendor in this war for either Germany or Britain or Russia. We three have chanced to be the biggest of the combatants, but the glory lies with invincible France. It is France and Belgium and Serbia who shine as the heroic lands. They have fought defensively and beyond all expectation for dear land and freedom. This war for them has been a war of simple, definite issues, to which they have risen with an entire nobility. Englishmen and German alike may well envy them that simplicity. I look to you, as an honest man schooled by the fierce lessons of this war, to meet me in my passionate desire to see France, Belgium, and Serbia emerge restored from all this blood and struggle, enlarged to the limits of their nationality, vindicated and secure. Russia I will not write about here. Let me go on at once to tell you about my own country, remarking only that between England and Russia there are endless parallelisms. We have similar complexities, kindred difficulties. We have, for instance, an imported dynasty. We have a soul-destroying state church, which cramps and poisons the education of our ruling class. We have a people out of touch with a secretive government, and the same traditional contempt for science. We have our Irelands and Polands. Even our kings bear a curious likeness." At this point there was a break in the writing, and Mr. Britling made, as it were, a fresh beginning. "Politically, the British Empire is a clumsy collection of strange accidents. It is a thing as little to be proud of as the outline of a flint or the shape of a potato. For the mass of English people, India and Egypt and all that side of our system mean less than nothing. Our trade is something they do not understand, our imperial wealth something they do not share. Britain has been a group of 4 democracies caught in the net of a vast yet casual imperialism. The common man here is in a state of political perplexity from the cradle to the grave. Nonetheless, there is a great people here, even as there is a great people in Russia, a people with a soul and character of its own, a people of unconquerable kindliness, and with a peculiar genius, which still struggle towards will and expression. We have been beginning that same great experiment that France and America and Switzerland and China are making, the experiment of democracy. It is the newest form of human association, and we are still but half awake to its needs and necessary conditions. For it is idle to pretend that the little city democracies of ancient times were comparable to the great essays in practical republicanism that mankind is making today. This age of the democratic republics that dawn is a new age. It has not yet lasted for a century, not for a paltry 100 years. All new things are weak things. A rat can kill a man-child with ease. The greater the destiny, the weaker the immediate self-protection may be. And to me, it seems that your complete and perfect imperialism, ruled by Germans for Germans, is in its scope and outlook a more antiquated and smaller and less noble thing than these sprawling, emergent giant democracies of the West that struggle so confusedly against it. But that we do struggle confusedly, with pitiful leaders and infinite waste and endless delay, that it is to our indisciplines and to the dishonesties and tricks our incompleteness provokes that the prolongation of this war is to be ascribed, I readily admit. At the outbreak of this war, I had hoped to see militarism felled within a year. 6. From this point onward, Mr. Britling's notes became more fragmentary. They had a consecutiveness, but they were discontinuous. His thought had leapt across gaps that his pen had had no time to fill, and he had begun to realize that his letter to the old people in Pomerania was becoming impossible. It had broken away into dissertation. "Yet there must be dissertations," he said. "Unless such men as we are take these things in hand, always we shall be misgoverned, always the sons will die." 7. I do not think you Germans realize how steadily you were conquering the world before this war began. Had you given half the energy and intelligence you have spent upon this war to the peaceful conquest of men's minds and spirits, I believe that you would have taken the leadership of the world tranquilly, no man disputing. Your science was 5 years, your social and economic organization was a quarter of a century in front of ours. Never has it so lain in the power of a great people to lead and direct mankind towards the world republic and universal peace. It needed but a certain generosity of the imagination. But your Junkers, your imperial court, your foolish, vicious princes, what were such dreams to them? With an envious satisfaction, they hurled all the accomplishment of Germany into the fires of war. 8. Your boy, as no doubt you know, dreamt constantly of such a world peace as this that I foreshadow. He was more generous than his country. He could envisage war and hostility only as misunderstanding. He thought that a world that could explain itself clearly would surely be at peace. He was scheming always, therefore, for the perfection and propagation of Esperanto or Edo, or some such universal link. My youngster, too, was full of a kindred and yet larger dream, the dream of human science, which knows neither king nor country nor race. These boys, these hopes, this war has killed. That fragment ended so. Mr. Britling ceased to read for a time. "But has it killed them?" he whispered. "If you had lived, my dear, you and your England would have talked with a younger Germany, better than I can ever do." He turned the pages back, and read here and there with an accumulating discontent. 9. "Dissertations," said Mr. Britling. Never had it been so plain to Mr. Britling that he was a weak, silly, ill-informed, and hasty-minded writer, and never had he felt so invincible a conviction that the Spirit of God was in him, and that it fell to him to take some part in the establishment of a new order of living upon the earth. It might be the most trivial part by the scale of the task, but for him it was to be now his supreme concern. And it was an almost intolerable grief to him that his services should be, for all his desire, so poor in quality, so weak in conception. Always he seemed to be on the verge of some illuminating and beautiful statement of his cause. Always he was finding his writing inadequate, a thin treachery to the impulse of his heart. Always he was finding his effort weak and ineffective. In this instance, at the outset, he seemed to see with a golden clearness the message of brotherhood or forgiveness of a common call. To whom could such a message be better addressed than to those sorrowing parents? From whom could it come with a better effect than from himself? And now he read what he had made of this message. It seemed to his jaded mind a pitifully jaded effort. It had no light. It had no depth. It was like the disquisition of a debating society. He was distressed by a fancy of an old German couple, spectacled and peering, puzzled by his letter. Perhaps they would be obscurely hurt by his perplexing generalizations. Why, they would ask, should this Englishman preach to them? He sat back in his chair wearily, with his chin sunk upon his chest. For a time he did not think, and then he read again the sentence in front of his eyes. These boys, these hopes, this war has killed. The words hung for a time in his mind. No, said Mr. Britling stoutly, they live. And suddenly it was borne in upon his mind that he was not alone. There were thousands and tens of thousands of men and women like himself, desiring with all their hearts to say, as he desired to say, the reconciling word. It was not only his hand that thrust against the obstacles. Frenchmen and Russians sat in the same stillness, facing the same perplexities. There were Germans seeking a way through to him, even as he sat and wrote. And for the first time, clearly, he felt a presence of which he had thought very many times in the last few weeks, a presence so close to him that it was behind his eyes and in his brain and hands. It was no trick of his vision. It was a feeling of immediate reality. And it was Hugh that he had thought was dead. It was young Heinrich living also. It was himself. It was those others that sought. It was all these, and it was more. It was the Master, the Captain of mankind. It was God, there present with him, and he knew that it was God. It was as if he had been groping all this time in the darkness, thinking himself alone amidst rocks and pitfalls and pitiless things. And suddenly a hand, a firm, strong hand, had touched his own. And a voice within him bade him be of good courage. There was no magic trickery in that moment. He was still weak and weary, a discouraged rhetorician, a good intention ill-equipped. But he was no longer lonely and wretched, no longer in the same world with despair. God was beside him, and within him, and about him. It was the crucial moment of Mr. Britling's life. It was a thing as light as the passing of a cloud on an April morning. It was a thing as great as the first day of creation. For some moments he still sat back with his chin upon his chest, and his hands dropping from the arms of his chair. Then he sat up and drew a deep breath. This had come almost as a matter of course. For weeks his mind had been playing about this idea. He had talked to Letty of this finite God, who is the king of man's adventure in space and time. But hitherto God had been for him a thing of the intelligence, a theory, a report, something told about but not realized. Mr. Britling's thinking about God hitherto had been like someone who has found an empty house, very beautiful and pleasant, full of the promise of a fine personality. And then, as the discoverer makes his lonely, curious explorations, he hears downstairs, dear and friendly, the voice of the Master coming in. There was no need to despair, because he himself was one of the feeble folk. God was with him indeed, and he was with God. The king was coming to his own. Amidst the darknesses and confusions, the nightmare cruelties and the hideous stupidities of the Great War, God, the captain of the World Republic, fought his way to empire. So long as one did one's best and utmost in a cause so mighty, did it matter though the thing one did was little and poor? I have thought too much of myself, said Mr. Britling, and of what I would do by myself. I have forgotten that which was with me. 10. He turned over the rest of the night's writing presently, and read it now as though it was the work of another man. These later notes were fragmentary and written in a sprawling hand. Let us make ourselves watchers and guardians of the order of the world. If only for love of our dead. Let us pledge ourselves to service. Let us set ourselves with all our minds and all our hearts to the perfecting and working out of the methods of democracy, and the ending forever of the kings and emperors and priestcrafts and the bands of adventurers, the traders and owners and forestallers, who have betrayed mankind into this morass of hate and blood, in which our sons are lost, in which we flounder still. How feeble was this squeak of exhortation! It broke into a scolding note. "Who have betrayed," read Mr. Britling, and judged the phrase. "Who have fallen with us," he amended. "One gets so angry and bitter, because one feels alone, I suppose. Because one feels that for them one's reason is no reason. One is enraged by the sense of their silent and regardless contradiction, and one forgets the power of which one is a part." The sheet that bore the sentence he criticized was otherwise blank, except that written across it obliquely in a very careful hand were the words "Hugh" and "Hugh Philip Britling." On the next sheet he had written, "Let us set up the peace of the world republic amidst these ruins. Let it be our religion, our calling." There he had stopped. The last sheet of Mr. Britling's manuscript may be more conveniently given in facsimile than described. "Hugh, Hugh, my dear Hugh, lawyers, princes, dealers in contention. Honesty, blood, can make an end of them. 11. He sighed. He looked at the scattered papers and thought of the letter they were to have made. His fatigue spoke first. "Perhaps, after all, I'd better just send the fiddle." He rested his cheeks between his hands, and remained so for a long time. His eyes stared unseeingly. His thoughts wandered and spread and faded. At length he recalled his mind to that last idea. Just send the fiddle, without a word. No, I must write to them plainly, about God as I have found him, as he has found me. He forgot the Pomeranians for a time. He murmured to himself. He turned over the conviction that had suddenly become clear and absolute in his mind. Religion is the first thing and the last thing, and until a man has found God and been found by God, he begins at no beginning, he works to no end. He may have his friendships, his partial loyalties, his scraps of honor, but all these things fall into place, and life falls into place, only with God. Only with God. God, who fights through men against blind force and night and non-existence, who is the end, who is the meaning. He is the only king. Of course I must write about him. I must tell all my world of him. And before the coming of the true king, the inevitable king, the king who is present whenever just men foregather, this blood-stained rubbish of the ancient world, these puny kings and tawdry emperors, these wily politicians and artful lawyers, these men who claim and grab and trick and compel, these war-makers and oppressors, will presently shrivel and pass, like paper thrust into a flame. Then, after a time, he said, Our sons who have shown us God. 12. He rubbed his open hands over his eyes and forehead. The night of effort had tired his brain, and he was no longer thinking actively. He had a little interval of blankness, sitting at his desk with his hands pressed over his eyes. He got up presently, and stood quite motionless at the window, looking out. His lamp was still burning, but for some time he had not been writing by the light of his lamp. Insensibly, the day had come, and abolished his need for that individual circle of yellow light. Color had returned to the world, clean pearly color, clear and definite like the glance of a child or the voice of a girl, and a golden wisp of cloud hung in the sky over the tower of the church. There was a mist upon the pond, a soft gray mist not a yard high. A covey of partridges ran and halted, and ran again in the dewy grass outside his garden railings. The partridges were very numerous this year, because there had been so little shooting. Beyond in the meadow, a hare sat up as still as a stone. A horse neighed. Wave after wave of warmth and light came sweeping before the sunrise across the world of matching zizi. It was as if there was nothing but morning and sunrise in the world. From away towards the church came the sound of some early worker whetting a scythe. End of Book 3, Chapter 2. End of Mr. Britling Sees It Through by H.G. Wells. Recorded by Peter Eastman, 2014. Thank you for listening.